Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Peace and blessings of Allah be upon you, dear viewers. Welcome to tonight's live online lecture organized by the UK Talim Department. As per our tradition, we will start with the recitation of the Holy Quran. If I could please request Moeed Hamid Sahib to recite a portion.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. The portion which I'm going to recite today is from Surah Al-Baqarah, which is the second chapter, and the verses are 262 and 263. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. مثل الذين ينفقون أموالهم في سبيل الله كمثل حبة أنبتت 7 سنابل في كل سنبلة 100 حبة والله يضاعف لمن يشاء والله واسع عليم. الذين ينفقون أموالهم في سبيل الله ثم لا يطبعون ما أنفقوا منا وعلى أذى لهم أجرهم عند ربهم ولا خوف عليهم ولا هم يحزنون. Translation of these verses. In the name of Allah, most gracious, ever merciful. The similitude of those who spend their wealth in the way of Allah is like the similitude of a grain of corn, which grows 7 years. In each year, 100 grains. And Allah multiplies it further for whomsoever He pleases. And Allah is bountiful, all-knowing. They who spend their wealth in the way of Allah then follow not up what they have spent with taunt or injury. For them is their reward with their Lord, and they shall have no fear, nor shall they grieve.
Jazakumullah Ahsan al-Jazaa. Tonight, dear viewers, we have the pleasure of being joined by Fahim Anwer Sahib, who is currently serving as National Secretary for Waqf-e-Jadeed, United Kingdom. He'll be speaking on the topic of Jihad, financial sacrifice, and Waqf-e-Jadeed. As always, there'll be an opportunity for you to ask questions. These will be put to our respected speaker on your behalf in the last 15 minutes. Please type your questions into the live chat and kindly ensure that they are relevant to tonight's topic. Just like to make viewers aware that unfortunately this evening we are facing some technical issues and delays. So please do bear with us as we try to resolve them. But it gives me great pleasure to hand over to Fahim Anwer Sahib to deliver tonight's lecture.
Jazakallah, Sahib. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh to all the viewers. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wahdahu la sharika lahu wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan abduhu wa rasuluh. Amma ba'du, fa'uzu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Jazakallah to the Talim team for giving me this opportunity to showcase Waqf-e-Jadeed. As mentioned already, there seem to be some technical issues. Hopefully we can make this work. there is a presentation that I want to share with you as I'm talking. So, Muqasab, if you can go to the title page. Brilliant. So, because of the technical issues, I'll just set the expectation. There were some video clips, however, we're not going to be able to play them today, unfortunately. However, I'll describe as best as I can what the content of those clips were. And Muqasab, I'll prompt you to go to the next slide. There are a number of animations built in as well, so hopefully we can make this work between us. As mentioned, this particular lecture presentation is titled Jihad, Financial Sacrifice and Waqf-e-Jadeed, which are three big areas of discussion on their own. However, I sincerely hope I'm able to tie this all together within the time I have available to me here. And I should first address as a starting point, the main issue in terms of jihad. So a lot of people have an issue with the term jihad, specifically Islamic jihad. It's still perceived very negatively in the Western world, and it's probably fair to say this has a lot to do with how the Western media have portrayed Islamic jihad. And the Muslim world hasn't helped this image either. There are still very strong sentiments within many sects of Islam that believe the concept of jihad is about backing the call of Islam with violence. So let's clear up what the word jihad actually means. If you can go to the next slide. So jihad is an Arabic word that can be translated as a struggle or the ability to strive. And according to Islamic teachings, there are three main categories of jihad. If you can go to the next slide. The first one is Jihad Akbar. And Jihad Akbar, which is the jihad of the highest order. And this jihad struggle is for self-reformation. The struggle is against our own temptations, such as greed, jealousy, lust, and other worldly temptations, such as materialism. This is a journey of a person from an animalistic state of existence that is living for the immediate gratification or gain to one where his psyche is disciplined enough to exercise moral control. And this type of jihad is compulsory upon every Muslim throughout their life. The next slide will show the second type of jihad, which is Jihad-e-Kabir, or the major jihad. This is the jihad of the propagation of the truth, the message of the Holy Quran. Allah tells us in the Holy Quran in chapter 16, verse 126, call unto the way of thy Lord with wisdom and goodly exhortation. And according to the Holy Quran, anyone who devotes his time, effort, wealth, or knowledge to the cause of righteousness is practicing Jihad-e-Kabir. This is also compulsory on all Muslims. And this is why Huzur Aqdas, the Khalifa, going all the way back to the Promised Messiah ﷺ, have laid so much stress on the aspect of tabligh. As we go to the next slide, the third type of jihad is Jihad-e-Asghar, or jihad of the lower order. This is the jihad that has gotten the most amount of attention, as alluded to earlier. However, this is the jihad of a defensive battle. The Quran has clearly restricted this type of jihad to certain conditions while forbidding transgressions of any sort. Those conditions being the battle can only be a defensive one and not an offensive one. That Muslims should have faced oppression in practice of their religion and a threat to their life. And that Muslims should have been driven out of their homes, and if the oppressor attacks the Muslims, to stop them from practicing their religion in the new place and still continues to threaten their lives. Only in these circumstances are Muslims allowed to take up arms in a defensive battle. It is also important to note that starting of such a battle is not in the hands of the Muslims, but can only be initiated by an oppressor fulfilling the aforementioned conditions. Next slide, please. So the Holy Prophet ﷺ, his entire life was devoted to jihad. However, of this, a mere 4 months was spent by way of defensive battles, and in them the cause and objective is beyond dispute. Once, while returning from a battle, the Holy Prophet ﷺ reminded his followers that they are returning from the jihad of a lower order to jihad of the highest order. That is, they need to resume the effort of self-reformation without delay. On another occasion, the Holy Prophet ﷺ had said that out of all those who carry out jihad, the most exalted is the one who strives against his own passions. Next slide, please. So we've now established what the true concept of jihad is, and it is with the advent of the Promised Messiah, Hazrat Mirza Ghulam Ahmad, the great champion and defender of the true Islam, that the real aspect of Islamic jihad has been properly realized. The Promised Messiah made clear that the obligation of jihad-e-askar, or jihad of the lower order, has been postponed in this age on account of the absence of the conditions that call for it. The Prophet Messiah did not eliminate jihad by the sword, nor could he do so, as he was bound by the Quran. The Prophet Messiah merely declared its postponement. He cited the hadith that the Holy Prophet ﷺ had prophesied that the awaited Messiah would not fight with the sword, as his age would be a time of religious freedom. So it is only Jamaat Ahmadiyya and the Khalifa of Islam that is constantly and consistently at the forefront of reclaiming the meaning of jihad to its correct understanding in this day and age. Next slide, please. Hazrat Amir al-Mu'mineen said in his Friday sermon of March 31st, 2006, "In this age of the Messiah, a type of jihad is that of financial sacrifice. This facilitates publication of literature in defense of Islam, translations of the Holy Quran in various languages of the world and dispatching them to the corners of the earth. It establishes missions all over the world and trains missionaries to be sent all over the world. Mosques are built with these funds, as are schools and colleges and hospitals to serve the suffering of humanity." Huzur continues by saying, "Until such time that the message of Islam reaches every corner of the earth and to each person in each of these corners, and until such time that each need of the poor and needy is not met, this financial jihad has to continue, and each Ahmadi has to take part in it according to their capacity." Next slide. So we now move on to the subject of jihad, or striving with one's wealth, otherwise known as financial sacrifice. So what does Allah the Almighty say in the Quran on this matter? In chapter 61, verses 11 and 12, Allah the Almighty says, "O you who believe, shall I point out to you a bargain that will save you from a painful punishment? That you believe in Allah and His Messenger and strive in the cause of Allah with your wealth and your persons. That is better for you if you did not know." As a Muslim Maud commented on this verse, and he wrote, "The reference for this verse seems to be for the present time, the era of the promised Messiah, in which, in the absence of religious wars, monetary sacrifice is given precedence over other forms of sacrifice. The present is the time for propagation of Islamic principles and ideals for which money, more than anything else, is urgently needed." Elsewhere in the Holy Quran, if we go to the next slide, in chapter 4, verses 96 to 97, Allah the Almighty says, "Those of the believers who sit still, accepting the disabled ones, and those who strive in the cause of Allah with their wealth and their persons are not equal. Allah has exalted in rank those who strive with their wealth and their persons above those who sit still. And to each Allah has promised good. And Allah has exalted those who strive above those who sit still by a great reward, namely by degrees of excellence bestowed by Him, and by special forgiveness and mercy. And Allah is most forgiving, merciful. Again, Hazrat Muslim Maud commented on these verses, and I'll read out the commentary on it. The verse speaks of the different classes of believers only, and not of the hypocrites. Believers are of two classes. Number one, those who sincerely accept the truth and try to live up to the teachings of Islam, but take no part in the struggle to defend and propagate the faith. These are, as it were, passive believers, sitters, as the verse names them. And then number two, those who not only live up to the teachings of Islam, but also vigorously participate in the work of its propagation. These are active believers, the strivers or mujahids, as they are called. The latter are far superior to the former in the sight of God. There is, however, a class of believers who, even though they do not join their brethren in actually fighting disbelievers, but get an equal reward with those who take part in actual struggle. These are referred to in the words, accepting the disabled ones. Their inability to take part in actual fighting is due to circumstances over which they have no control. They are heart and soul with the Muslims who are mujahid, wherever the latter go to fight in the cause of God. But their particular circumstances, disease, poverty, etc., do not allow them to join the expeditions in person. But the actual sitters, those entitled to good reward if true and sincere in their faith, were in no case on a par with the strivers, neither in rank nor reward. The commentary continues for the second verse. This verse further explains and emphasizes the distinction between the sitters at home without valid excuse and the strivers in the cause of God. The latter are not only superior to the former by many degrees, but are much more entitled to God's mercy and forgiveness. So you can see very clearly how Allah the Almighty bestows His blessings on those that truly strive and sacrifice in His cause. Elsewhere in the Quran, if you go to the next slide, in chapter 3, verse 93, Allah says, "You cannot attain to righteousness unless you spend out of that which you love. And whatever you spend, Allah surely knows it well." This verse has been commented on many times. However, the fourth Caliph of Islam, Ahmadiyya, Hazrat Mirza Tahir Ahmad Rahmatullah, once commented on this verse by stating, "The reason why the Holy Quran has repeatedly instructed us to make financial sacrifices is that these sacrifices purify people and cleanse their hearts." Huzur continued by saying, "The true philosophy and spirit of sacrifice is that you are like beggars in the path of Allah. If you do not make sacrifices, you will be the losers." And just as with the understanding the true essence of Islam on matters like jihad, on the matter of sacrifice, it is only Jamaat Ahmadiyya that is constantly and consistently at the forefront of the embodiment of the spirit of sacrifice in the way of Allah the Almighty. If you can go to the next slide, please. No other community consistently gives as much personal time to its projects and activities. No other community consistently gives so much of its personal wealth for the propagation of its values as well as to serve of humanity. No other community consistently puts the needs of others before its own needs, making sure that rights of guests, neighbors, and even strangers are fulfilled through a high level of hospitality and generosity. No other community has been doing all of the above, yet is vilified for its beliefs in certain parts of the world to the extent that its members are prevented from expressing their faith, held back from promotion, both in education and career, mentally and physically abused, outcast and ostracized, and even made to pay the ultimate price of having their life taken from them simply for what they believe in. This is the true spirit of sacrifice in mind and body. We are now approaching that time of year in this country when many people will be celebrating the festive season. This would typically be celebrated in parties and fun nights out in clubs. A lot of money would typically be spent on these events, and even by the individuals attending, glamming themselves up and spending huge amounts on food and drink. Adults and now many teenagers and youngsters would participate in decadent and debaucherous activities purely to gratify their own pleasures. Contrast this with the year end of Jamaat Ahmadiyya. Millions of members would be glued to the sermons of Huzur Aqdas, in which Huzur would typically tell our members to fulfill the rights of Allah the Almighty and that of His creation. The Waqf-e-Jadeed sermon is always given at the beginning of the new year. Huzur will relate the accounts of ordinary members making extraordinary financial sacrifices towards this blessed scheme. And it is important to highlight that while a large part of the world is celebrating and fulfilling its own personal needs, Jamaat Ahmadiyya, under the guidance of the Khalifa of Islam, is fulfilling the needs of a multitude of impoverished people living in the Indian subcontinent as well as East and West Africa. Last year in 2020, the total amount contributed for Waqf-e-Jadeed from the Ahmadiyya Jamaat was just over £10.5 million. Alhamdulillah. If you go to the next slide. In a This Week with Huzur segment from 15th of January of this year, a week after the Waqf-e-Jadeed sermon, Huzur Aqdas was visibly and wonderfully happy over the achievements of the UK and Germany Jamaats in Waqf-e-Jadeed contributions. So here I actually wanted to play a clip. However, the file size is too big and it would have caused more problems. However, for the reference of members, you can see the date. It's available on YouTube. And as I've mentioned, Huzur was almost jovial in this mulaqat. It was a mulaqat with the UK Murabbiyan. And at the end of the mulaqat, Huzur spoke to Amir Sahib UK, and highlighted that the competition between Germany and UK was very intense and very close. However, both parties put in a huge amount of effort. By the grace of Allah, the UK came first and Germany came second. Huzur commented that significant amounts had been contributed. And then Huzur commented about the efforts of the Lajna. And there were a few observations I made just from this small clip. Firstly, Huzur was very happy over the fact that the UK had come first, and we should come first. The UK Jamaat, by the grace of Allah, has been hosting Khilafat for almost 40 years. And we have had this privilege and this grace of Allah to host Khilafat, to have the Khalifa in amongst us. So it's about time that his instructions and his advice and his admonitions rub off on us, and we are now fulfilling and meeting the expectations of Huzur Aqdas. So the fact that we came first shouldn't be a surprise. We should be coming first and be at the forefront of these sacrifices. And then Huzur talked about the competition between Germany and UK and how a huge jump had been made from the previous year. Now, if you put this into context, 2020 was the year of the COVID-19 pandemic when it initially broke out, and it ground most of the world to a halt. Right? We as a generation and many generations had never seen anything like this. It was unprecedented. People were losing their livelihoods, losing their jobs. Businesses were going out of business. There was huge disruption, and there was a lot of concern. And I'm sure there was feedback going back to Huzur Aqdas that maybe we won't meet the same chandas as we did in the previous year when everything was normal. However, the result was to the contrary. We broke, in Waqf-e-Jadeed, globally, the 10 million mark barrier had been broken. And, it highlighted, and this also must have given pleasure to Huzur, that in a time of such disruption, Jamaat Ahmadiyya and the members of Jamaat Ahmadiyya didn't turn away from Allah in their time of need. In fact, they came closer to Him by sacrificing from their own wealth to win Allah's mercy and His love during this such a difficult time. So that must have caused hujur, happiness and contentment that the people get it. They are now falling out of love with money and materialism and falling in love with Allah. And then at the end, Huzur commented on the sacrifices of Lajna Maila, where in fact, in that particular year, they raised more for Waqf-e-Jadeed than they did for Tehreek-e-Jadeed, which is also unprecedented. It just doesn't normally happen. Tehreek-e-Jadeed is an older scheme, and it just generates more contributions. But in this particular year, Lajna Maila UK gave more. We were very happy over this fact. And our Lajna have always been at the forefront, and they've been our role models when it comes to instances of financial sacrifice, where they're the first to donate. And we would typically hear accounts and stories of women who, whenever the Khalifa called for such monetary sacrifices, they would take off their jewelry, their heirlooms, essentially, and give it. So all of these things culminated in Huzur being extremely happy, and I would encourage members to watch the clip when they can. My apologies for not being able to share it on this occasion. But if you go to the next slide, and the question here is there room for improvement? There was a clip I wanted to show in which Huzur comments on the matter of, or the subject of improvement. It wasn't to do with Waqf-e-Jadeed. It was in another This Week with Huzur segment. He's addressing something else. However, Huzur's answer was brilliant. It applied in every aspect. And essentially, Huzur was saying that, and if we apply it in our instance, the UK Jamaat have been coming first in Waqf-e-Jadeed, not only this year, but for quite a few years, by the grace of Allah. And so if you apply the Huzur's answer, that we can't just sit back and rest on our laurels that we've been coming first, we will always come first, and therefore it's not a problem. That's not the case in the slightest. There's always room for improvement. And Huzur was saying that you should reflect and analyze where you can do better. And so in our instance, when it comes to Waqf-e-Jadeed, there is definitely room for improvement. If the concept of jihad in the way of Allah is understood, if the spirit of sacrifice is properly understood, and if the purpose of this chanda is understood, then the amount people will contribute will be a lot more. So now let's move on to explaining about Waqf-e-Jadeed. If we go to the next slide. It should be known, it should be well known from the elders to the youngsters that the Waqf-e-Jadeed scheme was established and initiated by Hazrat Muslim Maud, Hazrat Mirza Bashiruddin Mahmud Ahmad Razila Ta'ala anhu. Okay, I'll go into this in a moment. If you go to the next slide. Hazrat Muslim Maud established a number of schemes in his Khilafat, which was over a period of over half a century. Many schemes were established and set up by Hazrat Muslim Maud. I'm sharing some important dates just to give you some perspective as to where Waqf-e-Jadeed sat in terms of some key dates in our history. So 1934 was the launch of Tehreek-e-Jadeed. And just to briefly talk about Tehreek-e-Jadeed, it was set up because there was a movement in India at the time that were essentially hell-bent on destroying and eradicating and removing Islam Ahmadiyya completely. That was their sole aim. And what Hazrat Muslim Maud did, he said, okay, you can try and do that, whereas I will set up Tehreek-e-Jadeed. and Tariq became this worldwide phenomenon that it is today, massively increased the spread of Islam Ahmadiyya globally and served a number of millions of people worldwide. In 1947, there was the partition of India-Pakistan. This is key to this particular aspect. 10 years later, Waqf-e-Jadeed was launched. I just want to read an extract from what the fourth Khalifa once said about the initiation of the scheme. So the fourth Khalifa once said that the initiation of this scheme was actually connected, one of the reasons why it was actually connected to a wish of the promised Messiah, alayhi salam. The following words of the promised Messiah, alayhi salam, make it quite clear that he wished to start a scheme like Waqf-e-Jadeed within India. Hazrat Masih Maud states in the book Victory of Islam, "It is the wish of this humble servant that for the spread of Islam, an excellent program should be set up, such that within the country of India, everywhere our representative preachers and speakers are calling God's creation to the truth, so that the teachings of Islam reach everyone on the face of this earth. However, this intention cannot be fully accomplished by this old and deficient servant." Regarding the background of Waqf-e-Jadeed, Hazrat Mirza Tahir Ahmad Rahmatullah stated, "May Allah send down countless blessings upon Hazrat Muslim Maud, because he fulfilled all the desires of the promised Messiah, or he laid the foundations for their fulfillment during his lifetime." Huzur continued, "The foundations of Waqf-e-Jadeed were also destined to be laid by his blessed hands. Therefore, in 1958, on the occasion of Eid al-Azha, Hazrat Muslim Maud announced the purpose of this scheme. From Peshawar to Karachi, we should cast the net of reformation and righteousness. The truth is that we are going to encircle East and West Pakistan for the sake of reformation and righteousness. We will need in excess of 10 million rupees. It is necessary to cast a big net so that through it our teachings can reach every dweller in every village, in every town. Hence, this was a large net cast by the hands of Hazrat Muslim Maud, which was given the name Waqf-e-Jadeed, the new dedication. And it was to be the last initiative of Hazrat Muslim Maud put forth before the community. Hazrat Mirza Tahir Ahmad Rahmatullah was appointed by Hazrat Muslim Maud as the first Nazir or director for Waqf-e-Jadeed. And he also remarked the reason for creating Waqf-e-Jadeed, the scheme was because of poor training and moral decline, for many reasons had grown to dangerous levels, especially after the India and Pakistan partition. So basically, let me just take a step back. So we had the partition in 1947. As a Muslim Maud, he did an assessment at the time, and there was huge moral decline in the Muslims in that country. This caused obviously a lot of concern to Hazrat Muslim Maud. In the early to mid 50s, another group reared its head in Pakistan who also wanted to eradicate Waqf-e-Jadeed completely from the face of the earth, similar to the Ahrar group from almost 10, 20 years earlier. So Hazrat Muslim Maud, the genius that he was, he established another scheme, Waqf-e-Jadeed scheme. And whenever we have this attack put upon us, be it persecution or otherwise, we would go out and do something even more astounding in the world. And so Huzur essentially asked for volunteers from amongst the youngsters, the Khuddam, to dedicate their lives and to go to the remote parts of Pakistan at the time and to reach out to those communities there. We had many Ahmadis who had accepted the teachings of the promised Messiah. However, they were living in these remote areas where the Jamaat at the time didn't have any resource to send the Murabbiyan to these locations. At the same time, in 1957 Pakistan, there were still many Hindus living in Pakistan, because a lot of them hadn't moved across into India. Their influence was affecting the Muslims at the time as well, be it culturally, the superstitions that come with it. It was having a huge negative effect on the Muslims. At the same time, so remember, there's a number of Hindus, probably millions of Hindus living in the country. Christian missionaries saw this, right? They saw that of the Hindus that were left behind in India, it was typically the lower castes, those who couldn't afford to move to India, they were left behind. And you have, within the caste system of Hinduism, you have what's known as the untouchables, the lowest level. They had to stay because they had no means to up and leave their things behind and move to another country and settle. They remained. So the Christian missionaries saw this as an opportunity to convert them to Christianity. So as a Muslim, I saw all of this, and it caused him great alarm, because you could argue that he was played a pivotal role in the creation of Pakistan. He could not stand for all of this to happen in this newly formed country. So we asked for these volunteers. These volunteers essentially dedicated their lives to go to these remote villages, to look after our members, the Ahmadis who are living there, and to reach out to the Hindus living there as well, and bring them closer to Islam Ahmadiyya and to preach to them. If we go to the next slide. Yep, keep going. Right, so the purpose of Waqf-e-Jadeed initially became twofold: for the Talim and Tarbiyat of Ahmadis living in these remote villages, and for the Tabligh to the Hindus living in these villages as well. And just as Ahmadiyyat was founded to breathe new life into Islam, in the same way, Waqf-e-Jadeed was initiated to raise the standards of physical, moral, and spiritual states of members living in the remote communities, lying outside the direct gaze of the headquarters, to an exalted station and breathe fresh life into them. We go to the next slide. So as already mentioned, Waqf-e-Jadeed is intended mainly for the rural communities of Pakistan. However, Hazrat Klimsi IV in 1986 broadened the scope of this scheme to include the whole of the Indian subcontinent, and as well as East and West Africa. And with the funds and donations from members living in well-off countries, sacrificing their wealth to help those in the remote and destitute areas in these developing countries. So essentially, these two regions is where Waqf-e-Jadeed focuses on, as opposed to Tehreek-e-Jadeed. Tehreek-e-Jadeed is more global. Waqf-e-Jadeed focuses on these two areas, and these two areas are well known as to be amongst the poorest in the world as well. If you go to the next slide. Again, there's a clip here, which I can't play, but I think that's probably good because I know I'm running out of time. However, you can see there's some bullet points along the side, and I'll briefly talk through these. So a very valid question is, I contribute to Waqf-e-Jadeed. I'm encouraged to contribute towards Waqf-e-Jadeed. Where does my money go? The money goes in a number of areas. So now we're raising in excess of £10 million per year, and there's projects across these two regions of the world. There are the muallimeen that are sent to these remote areas. Their training is funded. There is a college in Pakistan where these muallimeen are specifically trained. It's a slightly different course to that of Marabi, a shorter course. And then these muallimeen are trained and they're sent to these remote villages, in often remote villages. Mosques have been set up. So in the early years, where typically they would have mud huts as mosques, now by the grace of Allah, they're proper mosques, in that they look and They have the look and feel and shape of a mosque, and enough to hold, a sizable amount of the local community as well. Through this scheme, these villages, which literally have no infrastructure, there's no roads that go to these villages. There's no running water. There's no electricity. It's desert-like. However, through the donations of this scheme, the Jamaat Ahmadiyya has managed to bring in, through solar power, electricity, things where we take for granted. However, one plug point in a village is a game changer in a lot of cases, where mobile phones in the third world is fairly common because they're quite cheap, but they don't have the electricity points to charge their phones even. This is what we're talking about. So electricity has come in to these regions, enabling these people access to the wider world. It's also given them access to MTA. Typically, these villages, a lot of them have accepted Islam Ahmadiyyat. They may have seen a picture of the Khalifa. Now, because of solar energy, they're able to see, through MTA, they can see Huzur Iqtas and the other programs and what Jamaat Ahmadiyya is doing. Clean water has been facilitated as well. Hospitals, so the mortality rate in these regions, the regions that Waqf-e-Jadeed focuses on, is very high. Medication and such like is high on the agenda of Waqf-e-Jadeed as well. So hospitals have been set up and built in some of these regions served by Waqf-e-Jadeed. Typically, villagers would have never been to a hospital. They don't have the means to get there. It's tens of miles away, if not hundreds of miles away, to get to a hospital. And even if they can get there, the costs to be treated are so high that often they'll be like, you know what, I'll take care of it myself. Through Waqf-e-Jadeed, hospitals, doctors, these hospitals have been set up with a high level of equipment, enabling them to have things like X-rays and other treatment to assess their condition and then be treated accordingly. Things that they would never have had normal access to. Mobile health clinics. So not only are hospitals set up, but then we have teams of doctors that would stack up their van with medication and then go out to these remote villages. This is the extent that Jamaat Ahmadiyya does. It doesn't wait for them to come to you. It goes out to serve these people as well. Education is high on the agenda as well. Schools have been set up. Typically, these schools would have the people in these villages would have access to a very basic level of education. And the early Muallimeen that went there, that was part of their job, to educate them in how to read and write. But now, as the funds have grown, schools have been set up, boarding schools have been set up, even computer institutes. So a lot of facilities have been set up, things that we take for granted in the first world. In these regions, it's unheard of. And so Waqf-e-Jadeed is a huge blessing to these people, but to us as well, because now we know where, how people from the other side of the planet are now being helped through our donations. Can you go to the next clip? Next slide. Daftar al-Fal is something I want to highlight. This is quite key to Waqf-e-Jadeed. Hazrat Mirza Nasir Ahmad, the third Khalifa, Rahmullah, he established Daftar al-Fal. A lot of people get confused by the word Atfal. Atfal actually means children. So this is the office of children, Daftar Atfal, and it's Huzur set it up specifically for children under the age of 16, boys and girls, to start on their lifelong journey on financial sacrifice. So where I've talked about financial sacrifice in the beginning and how generally Jamaat is at the forefront of such things, these things don't happen overnight. It takes some understanding as to why one should sacrifice in the cause of Allah. So Huzur set this up specifically for children to understand what it means, and there were different layers to setting this up. Huzur essentially said that if the adults don't carry their weight financially, then it will be the children who will fulfill the gap. And by the grace of Allah, there's a YouTube khutbah available from 2008. It's the Waqf-e-Jadeed sermon, January 2008, in which Huzur Aqdas, he mentions that in that particular year, in the 2007 Waqf-e-Jadeed year, half the amount raised by Pakistan Jamaat came from the children. Now, that's a huge amount of sacrifice. And considering the fact that what Waqf-e-Jadeed provides, it provides all these services, education, medication to the people of Pakistan in these remote and poor villages. A lot of those people do not even accept our children as Muslims. They don't even accept them as first-class citizens of Pakistan. They're, second-class, third-class citizens. We know this already. However, our children are donating to help further them in, medically and in education as well. So they are the role models, and they're doing it purely to win the pleasure of Allah. Although they are the role models that we have in front of us. There are honorary titles given to Daftar al-Fa'il. If you go to the next slide. So in the UK, we have 3 levels. Young Mujahid is one that is a child that gives £24 per year. The next level up is a child that gives £36 per year. And Safiyawal, the highest level, is a child that gives £60 per year. Now, I know that there are adults, earning adults, who give less than this. So one of the intentions behind this, as mentioned earlier as well, is where the children pick up the slack. It gives an adult pause for thought that this child only gets pocket money or Eid or gifts for be it birthdays or whatnot, and I have an income, and I give 20-30 pounds. It's a pause for thought and for concern that I should actually be giving more because children are giving more than I am. And now hopefully that people understand the scope of Waqf-e-Jadeed. It give them more motivation to donate. If you go to the next slide, I know I'm running short of time as well. I encourage members to, again, go on YouTube, hunt down this sermon. Possibly from the viewers, there may be many viewers who may have not been born at this time. This was from the historic Friday sermon from the 10th of September 1982. It was just a few months after the 4th Khalifa was elevated to the station of Khilafat. It was on the inauguration of the mosque in Cordoba in Spain, the first purpose-built mosque after many centuries, a historic occasion. The khutbah is only available in Urdu, but I'm going to read a transcript. And it kind of touches upon the spirit of financial sacrifice that we should have, every one of us. And Huzur, in his own way, talked passionately about it. So I'm going to read this extract. Huzur says, "It is very strange that although we are called Ahmadis and have pledged our allegiance at the hands of the Prophet Messiah alayhi salam, and we claim that we shall always give precedence to our faith over all worldly matters, and we have pledged that we shall do our utmost to rescue Islam from all its travails, even if we have to sacrifice our very lives in this cause. Despite all this, we see that there are but a few members of the Jamaat who are bearing the burden which is supposed to be borne by millions. And nobody seems to realize this, and nobody seems to care. There doesn't arise any human sympathy or self-reproach that we too are part of this Jamaat. We too have made our pledges. We too are overwhelmed with the benevolence of the Prophet Messiah alayhi salam, who made us relish the true pleasures of Islam. We just stand there like someone on the shore watching a ship sink, and his heart is not in the least moved. Human sympathy therefore demands that these people too should be included. All of you who are attending this sermon should go back and spread this message in your surroundings. Tell those who are weak and are afraid of spending in the way of Allah that you are depriving yourselves both of virtue and of the blessings of Allah. You are even depriving yourselves of the world which you are striving for. Your wealth will decline. You will not see the happiness of your children. Before your very eyes, your pleasures shall vanish, and sorrow and worry shall have their place in your hearts. This is the destiny of Ahmadis who are moving away from Ahmadiyyat. This is what we have always experienced. Allah does not leave anyone's sacrifice unreciprocated. Have we ever seen one who makes sacrifices and his children are starving? Just look at how abundantly the family of the Promised Messiah ﷺ has been blessed. But these blessings are only as long as one realizes the basis on which they have been bestowed. If someone were to deceive himself that it is all because of his own ingenuity and sleight of his own hand, he would be foolish indeed. These blessings are the result of a few crumbs which the Promised Messiah ﷺ sacrificed in the cause of Allah. Even before he was granted prophethood, he had already given to Allah everything he possessed. All that we are reaping today is due to that sacrifice. And this is not all. There are hundreds of Ahmadi families who are enjoying the fruits of similar sacrifices. So I know we only have a few minutes left. I just want to end by saying that by the grace of Allah, the Waqf-e-Jadeed scheme has grown strength by strength every year. There's been huge achievements made, huge milestones achieved. And as mentioned earlier, even this year of the pandemic, which has spilled over into this year, we've gone even further in terms of contributions and participation. And all those who have sacrificed, I'm sure there are many viewers here who have seen the blessings of financial sacrifice upon them. Everyone will have their own account of how they gave, even though it hurt them to give, and then how Allah blessed them. I'll give you a very brief account. Someone just told me this earlier this evening, and he mentioned that his brother had got married, and for a number of years, 6-7 years even, they were childless. They weren't able to conceive a child, and it was of course of great concern. And so this person mentioned to his brother that, have you given anything on behalf of your unborn child? And the brother said he hadn't, and he was just encouraged to do so. That give for the sake of your unborn child, and Allah will bless all these kind of these sacrifices made. Long story short, as a result of this donation, they were able to conceive a child, and now they have 2 children by the grace of Allah. A very short, simple story. There are many others. However, due to lack of time, I'm unable to fully recount them. However, Jazakallah to the Taaleem team for giving this opportunity. If time allows, I'm happy to answer questions if time allows. But Jazakallah for your time and attention.
Jazakallah Fahim Sahib for a very, mashallah, inspiring and insightful lecture this evening. You've given us a very important context to the Waqf-e-Jadeed scheme, telling us about its origins, its background, the history, and I think also importantly for a lot of our members, where the funds go and what the money is used for. I think, mashallah, you've given some great insights and information about how that money is put to, mashallah, very effective use. We do have maybe time just for one question, if that's okay, Fahim Sahib. And I know you've referred to, in the beginning of your lecture, you presented many Quranic references about financial sacrifice. How would we be able to distinguish between a donation and a sacrifice?
Okay, so it's important. It's a valid question. I think, in very simple terms, there are many people who donate. There are many people who I'm not talking about Jamaat Ahmadiyya, even generally for charity, you hear people of making donations, and you'll have collection boxes. People will give £1 or two. We've just recently finished in the UK. We have the poppy appeal, and people have been given pounds and a couple of pounds for these poppies. That's a donation, right? You put your hand in your pocket and you've given some loose change. You haven't really felt it. You've probably forgotten about how much you even gave because the amount was almost insignificant. However, a sacrifice, as mentioned earlier, is something that you feel, right? And everybody's capacity is different. For one person, £100 is easy money to give away. For another person, that will hurt them, and that's something they will think about and have that internal discussion as should I really give £100? But that's a sacrifice, and we're reminded of this time and time again. In that when you're feeling that pain, because you know that money's not going to waste, it's going for the betterment of typically someone who is well deserving of it. In the case of Jamaat Ahmadiyya, we almost always give it away for the service of mankind. You know that donation is going to good use. Allah sees that pain that you have, that you gave £100 or a few £100 and you felt it, but you gave it out of your own heart to win Allah's pleasure. You purely did it to win Allah's pleasure, and you have that blessing and reward. That's what I think is the spirit of sacrifice, to kind of feel it and then know that, you know what, is in Allah's hands. Allah does not hold these amounts in hand, He returns it manyfold. And I think the verse at the beginning, the tilawat alluded to that as well.
And just one other question, Fahim Sahib. Again, you alluded to in your lecture the creation of Dastur Atfal in the time of Hazrat Khalifah Masih Salis Rahmahullah Ta'ala. How would you say, in your experience, are children able to be better motivated to contribute to the scheme?
Huzuri Aqdas gave a wonderful sermon on this as well. Again, there's certain almost landmark sermons that come out from time to time. And the 2008 sermon, Huzur focused on the children. He has done it since then as well, but this one stands out. Huzur even told us what to do, essentially. Huzur said that if children were to essentially put aside their burger and chips for I'm sure, and Huzur kind of mentioned that our children have it fairly frequently, and they really shouldn't. But if they put one of those meals to one side on a regular basis, then over time huge amounts can be generated to Waqf-e-Jadeed if that amount was given to Waqf-e-Jadeed. So it's a matter of training for these children as well, explaining to them what it is that they're giving towards, and it helps them to manage their money as well, and to manage to put aside an amount to charity, be it sadaqah, be it a charity, be it to another tahreek. But that's where that training starts, where those putting aside a few pounds every month, when they're adults and earning, by the grace of Allah, a good income, it would develop into huge sacrifices, which they would willingly give. It's part of their training.
Yeah, very much so. Jazakumullah. And mashallah, as expected, himself, we've received lots of very positive comments from our viewers this evening, thanking you for your time and for giving such a wonderful overview and an inspiring, informative lecture. So Jazakumullah Jaza for himself for your time this evening. It really is appreciated. And may Allah Ta'ala reward the Waqf-e-Jadeed department for all the great work that it's doing, and enable us to see it go from strength to strength. Ameen.
Ameen.
And that we are able to derive the satisfaction of Hazrat Masih Ayyadullah bil Aziz. Viewers, Jazakumullah Jaza for joining us again this evening. Our lectures will return next week. Our Urdu lectures return on Monday evening, and our English lecture will return a week today on Tuesday evening. So please stay tuned for further details of those lectures. If I could please request before we close our respected speaker tonight, Fahim Anwer Sahib, to please lead us in a silent prayer.
Please join me in dua. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Ameen.
Ameen. Jazakallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.